You probably check your bank app, right? Or your step counter.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, or like you might even have a smartwatch on right now, just silently logging your heart rate, your sleep cycles, maybe the exact number of calories you burned before breakfast.
We really do love our metrics.
We do. We love them. And I mean, there is a very good reason for that. Numbers give us a baseline for success. They give us, well, sort of the illusion of control.
Right.
But I want you to step back with us today, just for a bit, and think entirely outside of your own daily routine. How do you measure the success of an entire country?
That is the big question.
Right, because for almost a century, the global consensus had a very blunt, very simple answer. You just count the money.
Gross domestic product. Good old GDP.
Yeah, exactly.
It became the ultimate scoreboard. I mean, the assumption was always that if a country produces more value, more goods, just more sheer economic activity, it is inherently succeeding.
Right.
But GDP is a deeply flawed instrument if you're actually trying to figure out how human beings are doing.
Because it just measures volume, right?
Exactly. It measures the volume of the economy, but it tells you absolutely nothing about the human reality on the ground.
Yeah.
You could have a nation with a skyrocketing GDP because, it is strip mining its own natural resources.
Wow.
But meanwhile, its citizens are dealing with crumbling hospitals, terrible schools, and just massive destabilizing wealth inequality.
So the chart is pointing up, but the society is essentially failing.
Precisely.
Which brings us to the sources you provided for today's deep dive. We are looking at a completely different kind of dashboard.
A much better dashboard, I'd argue.
Definitely.
Yeah.
We have an extensive set of data from the United Nations Development Program, specifically their Human Development Reports tracking global progress from 1990 all the way through 2023.
It is a massive stack of data.
It really is. And
Yeah.
nestled within all this data is a highly detailed 15-page case study of one specific nation, Slovenia.
Which is such a fascinating case.
It is. So today, our mission is to explore how this relatively small European nation used a totally different set of metrics to quietly beat the world's massive superpowers at, well, the ultimate test of human progress.
And to understand how they did this, we have to look at the exact dashboard they are being graded on.
Right, let's break that down.
So the UNGP uses something called the Human Development Index, or the HDI. It was basically created to force economists to look away from raw national income and start looking at people.
What does it actually measure then?
The HDI measures three fundamental pillars: a long and healthy life, access to knowledge, and a decent standard of living.
Okay, so health, education, and income. It's a three-pronged approach.
Exactly.
But before we get into how Slovenia scores on those three pillars, there is this foundational concept we have to tackle first. Because there is a statistic in your sources that completely reframes how we should view global success.
Oh, you're talking about the inequality metric.
Yes, it just absolutely blew my mind.
Yeah, the efficiency loss metric. This is where the HDI gets incredibly revealing. The UN basically calculates what a country's human development score could be if health, education, and wealth were distributed perfectly equally among every single citizen.
Like a perfect utopian baseline.
Right. Then they look at the actual reality of how those resources are actually distributed. And the mathematical gap between that utopian potential and the messy that is called the efficiency loss due to inequality.
And here's the number that should just stop you in your tracks. If you are listening right now, really think about this. In 2023, the global average efficiency loss was 21.9%.
Nearly 22%.
Almost a quarter of all human potential on Earth just lost.
It's staggering.
Right, think of it like a leaky bucket. Imagine the entire world is handed a massive wooden bucket filled to the brim with water.
Okay, I like this analogy.
And that water represents all the incredible advancements of modern society. The pediatric care, the universities, the public infrastructure, all the sheer wealth generated by the global economy.
Right, all the good stuff.
Exactly. And the goal is to carry this bucket to the citizens so they can actually drink from it and thrive. But the bucket is fundamentally flawed. It is riddled with structural holes.
And those holes are the systemic inequalities we see everywhere. The rural versus urban healthcare deserts,
Yeah.
the generational hoarding of wealth, the racial disparities in lending.
Exactly. So by the time the world carries this bucket to the average citizen, nearly 22% of the water has already leaked out into the dirt. It is just wasted.
Right.
Now, keep that leaky bucket in your mind and let's look at Slovenia. In 2023, their efficiency loss due to inequality was not 21.9%. It wasn't even 10%. It was 4.9%.
Which is just an incredibly rare statistical anomaly.
4.9%.
I mean, most high-income countries, including the massive economic engines in North America and Western Europe, they struggle to get their inequality loss below double digits.
Really? Even the richest countries?
Oh, absolutely. Because wealth naturally stratifies in capitalist systems. Health outcomes start to diverge based on, what zip code you live in. Education quality fractures between elite private institutions and underfunded public schools.
Right, the holes in the bucket.
Exactly. To achieve a loss rate of just 4.9% means Slovenia has engineered an almost totally airtight bucket.
So they're carrying the water, and essentially all of it is actually reaching the people.
Yes.
But how does a 4.9% loss rate actually translate to their position on the world stage? Because we know they aren't the richest country on earth in pure growth numbers, right?
Right. They aren't. In the Standard Human Development Index for 2023, Slovenia ranks 21st in the world.
Okay, 21st.
Which places them firmly in the top 10% globally, in the very high human development tier.
That's a solid rank.
It is.
Yeah.
But that baseline rank is just the beginning of the story. Because as we apply different filters for fairness and equality like we just discussed, their standing becomes even more robust.
So it's not just about the raw output.
No, it tells us that underneath the obsession with raw economic output, they have built an exceptionally resilient social model. Furthermore, in the Gender Inequality Index, they rank 14th globally.
Wow, 14th. So they are really sitting in that top percentile across the board.
Firmly in the top 10%.
But you don't just wake up one morning, pass a couple of tax laws, and suddenly your entire society operates with 95% efficiency in human development.
No, definitely not.
Building an airtight bucket takes decades. So let's look at the timeline data gives us, tracing this evolution from 1990 to 2023.
33 years is a fantastic sample size to see how policy actually shapes a society over a generation.
Let's trace the baseline numbers first. So the HDI is measured on a scale from 0 to 1, right? With 1 being absolute utopian perfection.
Correct.
In 1990, Slovenia's score was 0.734. By 2023, the number climbed to 0.931.
Which is a huge leap.
It's a 26% increase. And over that exact same 33-year period, the global average moved from 0.608 to 0.756.
So both the world and Slovenia are moving up, which is exactly what you want to see. I mean, the world moving from 0.6 to 0.75 represents hundreds of millions of people escaping extreme poverty and massive gains in basic global literacy.
Right. But I'm going to play the skeptic here for a second, if you don't mind.
Go for it.
Let's look at that timeline, 1990 to 2023. Think about what happened during those 3 decades. We had the commercialization of the internet.
Yeah.
We mapped the human genome.
Yeah.
We saw the explosion of global supply chains bringing cheaper goods everywhere. Didn't everyone just naturally ride that massive wave of technological and medical progress?
That's a fair point.
Like, why is Slovenia's 26% jump any different than just, the rising tide lifting all boats?
It is a totally valid question, and it is exactly why you can't just look at the start and end points of a data set. You have to look at the shape of the curve in between them.
Okay, so what does the curve show?
Yes, there was a rising global tide. But if you analyze the year-over-year trend lines in the source data, the global average growth rate eventually starts to plateau.
Ah.
And then, during the recent global pandemic years, the world average actually suffered severe contractions. The tide went out.
The global bucket sprung a massive leak.
Precisely. But Slovenia's curve tells a different story. Around 2013, their growth doesn't just run parallel to the world average anymore. It actively accelerates away from it.
Really? They broke away from the path.
Yeah. And during the global shocks of the early 2020s, their trajectory remained highly insulated. They weren't just passively floating on global technological progress. They had built internal mechanisms that generated their own momentum and basically protected their citizens from external shocks.
That is fascinating. So let's actually break down what that 0.931 score means for a human being walking the streets of Ljubljana today.
Let's do it.
Let's start with the first pillar, health. The UN measures this using a very blunt, very unforgiving metric, right? Life expectancy at birth.
It is the ultimate diagnostic tool for a society.
Because it captures so much.
It encompasses everything, from the quality of prenatal care to the cleanliness of the drinking water, the stress levels of the workforce, and even the physical safety of the communities.
Everything feeds into that one number.
Exactly.
Well, the data tells us that in 2023, the global average life expectancy is 75.9 years for women and 71.0 years for men.
Okay.
But in Slovenia, the overall life expectancy reached an astonishing 81.6 years.
Wow.
We're talking about an advantage of 4.3 extra years for Slovenian women compared to the global average, and a massive 7.9 extra years for Slovenian men.
I really want you listening to sit with that number for a second. We're talking about an entire extra decade of existence, on average, compared to the global baseline.
An extra decade.
How does a country literally manufacture 10 extra years of life for its people?
I mean, it has to be more than just having good MRI machines, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Advanced medical technology is available in plenty of countries that have much lower life expectancies.
Right, because you have to be able to access the machines.
Exactly. Manufacturing a decade of extra life requires a holistic approach to human biology and environment. It means your society has vanishingly low rates of infant mortality.
Yeah.
It means your adult population has access to preventative health care, so chronic diseases like, hypertension or diabetes are managed early, rather than becoming fatal emergencies in a patient's 50s.
That makes a huge difference.
It does.
Yeah.
It also means you have stringent regulations on workplace safety and environmental pollutants. Every single choice a government makes regarding public health feeds directly into that 81.6 number.
So they have secured an extra decade of life. But it's one thing to just keep people breathing longer. The next logical question is, what are those citizens equipped to do with those extra years?
Right, which brings us to the second pillar of the HDI, knowledge and education.
And this is where the data shows Slovenia really pulling away from the pack. The UN measures the education dimension using two specific indicators, right?
Yes. Mean years of schooling, which looks backward at the adult population, and expected years of schooling, which looks forward at children entering the system today.
Okay, let's look at the adults first. Mean years of schooling basically asks, on average, how many years of formal education has a citizen over the age of 25 actually completed?
Right.
Globally, in 2023, that average is a sobering 8.77 years.
Think about what that means. Globally, the average human being does not even finish a standard secondary education. They leave the schooling system somewhere around what we would consider early high school or junior high.
That's rough. But in Slovenia, the mean years of schooling sits at 12.95.
12.95.
That is a difference of 4.1 extra years of schooling per citizen compared to the global average.
4 extra years of baseline education across an entire population changes the fundamental DNA of an economy.
Because it's essentially the difference between dropping out of high school and finishing a bachelor's degree.
Exactly. When your foundational workforce has nearly 13 years of education instead of 8, the types of industries you can sustain shift dramatically.
You aren't just relying on low-skill manual labor anymore.
No, you are fostering a population capable of complex problem-solving, high-level civic engagement, and rapid adaptation to new technologies. You are building a true knowledge economy.
And their pipeline for the next generation is even more aggressive, isn't it?
Very much so.
The expected years of schooling metric, which is what a child starting school today can mathematically expect to complete, hits 17.4 years in Slovenia.
17.4.
And the world average is just 13.04.
17.4 years means the entire social infrastructure is designed around the assumption that a child will not only finish secondary school, but will almost certainly proceed through a full university degree and likely into specialized postgraduate training.
That's incredible.
It really is an expectation of constant intellectual development.
Okay, let's take a breath and evaluate what we found so far.
Sure.
We have a population that lives to be nearly 82 years old, with an educational baseline that rivals the most elite academic nations on Earth. So, as the proxy for the skeptical listener right now, I have to look for the flaw.
Fair enough. Utopia doesn't exist.
Exactly.
Right.
Where is the catch in this data?
You are right to look for the friction. And, the UNDP data is highly transparent about where even the most successful countries fall short. We've covered health and education. The third pillar of human development is the standard of living, measured by gross national income, or GNI per capita.
And here we find the glaring issue, the income data for 2023.
Yes.
We are looking at figures adjusted for purchasing power parity, so this reflects actual spending power, not just inflated numbers.
Right.
For Slovenian women, the GNI is $37,397. But for Slovenian men, it is $55,247.
It is a massive disparity.
Wait, I need you to reconcile this for me. Because we just established that men and women in Slovenia are receiving virtually the exact same amount of world-class education.
That's right.
They are sitting in the same classrooms for 13 to 17 years. So how do they enter the economy and end up with a wage gap of nearly $17,850?
It's a huge gap.
Are women just universally choosing lower-paying jobs? Or is there a structural bias at play here?
It is the defining last-mile challenge of modern development and requires us to look at the difference between educational access and economic mechanics. First, let's acknowledge that both of those figures, 37,000 and 55,000, place Slovenia securely in the high-income global bracket.
Right, no one is starving.
No, but that $17,000 gap reveals deep structural realities that education alone just cannot fix.
What are those realities?
Several things happen simultaneously. First, there is occupational segregation. Even with equal years of schooling, women are often culturally or structurally steered toward the public sector. Teaching, nursing, social work,
Fields that are super important.
vital to human development,
Yeah.
but traditionally undervalued by the capitalist wage market. Meanwhile, male-dominated sectors like engineering, high-tech manufacturing, and corporate finance pull in exponentially higher salaries.
That makes sense.
Second, there's the deeply entrenched motherhood penalty.
Right, the biological and societal reality of having children.
Yes. When women take time out of the labor force for child-rearing, even in a country with supportive leave policies, they lose critical years of wage progression and compound experience.
And men don't face that.
Men rarely face an equivalent fatherhood penalty in their earnings trajectory. Furthermore, the highest echelons of corporate executive power, the roles that heavily skew the GNI averages upward, they remain stubbornly resistant to gender parity globally.
So even the global straight-A student hasn't figured out how to fully dismantle the gendered nature of capitalism.
Not yet.
But this brings me back to a mathematical puzzle that is really bothering me.
Yeah, what is it?
If there is a nearly $18,000 income gap between men and women, how on earth is their overall inequality loss rate only 4.9%?
Ah, I see where you're going.
Shouldn't a massive wage gap like that blow a huge hole in the side of that leaky bucket we talked about?
It is a brilliant observation. And to answer it, we have to dive into the mechanics of a specific metric called the Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index, or the IHDI.
Explain how that works, because clearly the math is doing something very interesting here.
The standard HDI is an average. It tells you the average life expectancy, the average education, the average income. But averages can lie. You could have 2 billionaires and 98 people in extreme poverty, and the average wealth might look okay. The IHDI was basically created to punish countries for that kind of disparity. It takes the baseline HDI score and mathematically discounts it based on how unequally those three pillars are distributed across the population.
So if a country is highly unequal, their IHDI score plummets.
Exactly. Now, Slovenia's raw baseline HDI is 0.931. When the UN applies the inequality penalty across the entire society, their IHDI score drops to 0.885.
Okay.
The difference between those two numbers is where that 4.9% loss rate comes from.
But again, how does the score survive the massive income gap? Why doesn't it drop further?
Because of how the three pillars interact. This is the funnel effect.
Yeah.
Think of health and education as massive societal shock absorbers.
Shock absorbers. Okay.
Yes, there is a significant inequality in the income dimension. The UN's math registers that flaw. However, the health outcomes, living to 81, and the educational access, getting 13 to 17 years of schooling, those are distributed with near-perfect equality across the entire Slovenian population.
Regardless of gender or region.
Regardless of gender, region, or family background.
Oh, I see. So the strength of the first two pillars literally props up the weakness of the third.
Precisely. If a society has a substantial income gap, but the poorer citizens still live incredibly long, healthy lives and still receive world-class free education, the overall damage to human development is drastically contained.
That is so interesting.
The structural foundation of the society is so profoundly democratic and robust that the income fracture at the top doesn't bring down the house. It acts as a safety net that catches the economic disparity before it can ruin a citizen's actual quality of life.
That is a fascinating way to understand how public policy actually functions. You can't fix every problem at once, obviously, but if you guarantee health and knowledge, you insulate your people from the worst effects of economic unfairness.
Exactly. It proves that while money is important, it is not the sole determinant of a fair and functional society.
Which is a perfect segue, because while that $18,000 income gap is a real flaw, if we pivot and look at almost every other metric regarding the lives of men and women, the data shows Slovenia operating in an entirely different stratosphere.
Let's dig into the specific data on gender.
Yeah. The UN tracks this using the Gender Inequality Index, the GII. This metric looks at three crucial areas, right?
Yes. Reproductive health, political and social empowerment, and economic status. And unlike the HDI, where a higher number is better, the GII is a measure of disparity.
So lower is better.
Exactly. A score of 0 would mean absolute flawless equality. A score of 1 would mean total inequality.
Let's look at the historical data. In 1990, Slovenia's GII was 0.287. That is already a fairly decent score for the early 90s. But look at the trajectory. By 2023, their GII plummeted to an astonishing 0.042.
To really comprehend how incredible a score of 0.042 is, you have to place it against the global backdrop.
The world average in 2023 is stuck at 0.455.
Right.
So Slovenia is operating with less than a tenth of the gender inequality of the global average. How did they achieve that kind of drop?
We can see the mechanics of it by breaking down the specific components of the GII. Let's start with the most fundamental baseline of reproductive health: maternal mortality.
The maternal mortality ratio measures the number of women who die from pregnancy-related causes per 100,000 live births. In Slovenia, in 2023, that number is just 4.5.
4.5 deaths per 100,000 births. I want you to really consider the massive web of infrastructure required to achieve that number.
It's hard to even picture.
In the early 1990s, the global average for maternal mortality was well over 360 deaths per 100,000 live births.
Over 360.
And even today, there are parts of the world where that number remains heartbreakingly unacceptably high.
Because dropping that number isn't just about having a doctor in the room during delivery.
No, it requires a comprehensive, unbroken chain of care. It requires universal access to prenatal screening, so complications are caught months in advance.
Right.
It requires highly trained surgical teams available at a moment's notice in every region of the country, not just the capital city. It requires robust postpartum care. Achieving a mortality rate of 4.5 is the ultimate proof that a society values the lives of its women enough to fund the complex, expensive infrastructure required to keep them safe.
So they have secured the biological foundation. But gender equality isn't just about surviving childbirth. It's about having a voice in how the country is run. Let's look at the political empowerment data. The GII tracked the share of parliamentary seats held by women.
This is where we see the difference between organic cultural change and targeted policy.
In 1990, women held only 7.7% of parliamentary seats in Slovenia. By 2023, that number had surged to 31.5%.
That's a huge jump.
No, the global average is 26.5%, so they are noticeably ahead of the curve. But what really stands out in the timeline data here are these sudden vertical spikes.
Oh, yes.
The numbers don't just creep up by a fraction of a percent every election cycle. There is a massive jump in 2011 and another huge spike in 2022. Why does political representation suddenly leap forward like that?
When you analyze political data and see sudden vertical spikes in minority or female representation, it almost never reflects a sudden magical shift in the hearts and minds of the voting public.
No.
No, it reflects a systemic intervention. It points to the implementation of mechanisms like legislated candidate quotas.
Meaning the political parties are legally required to field a certain percentage of female candidates.
Exactly. And again, we aren't taking a stance on the politics of this, but looking purely at the data. When you implement a quota, you aren't waiting 50 years for entrenched patriarchal power structures to organically decide to share power. You force the door open immediately.
You change the mathematical composition of the ballot.
Yes, which inevitably changes the composition of the parliament. Those spikes in 2011 and 2022 show a society that is actively using legislative tools to engineer political parity.
Okay, so we have deeply secured reproductive health, and we have aggressively mandated political representation. Let's look at how that empowerment translates into the everyday lives of citizens, specifically in education and labor.
The UN measures educational empowerment here by looking at the percentage of the adult population, ages 25 and older, who have achieved at least some secondary education. And the data from Slovenia reveals what is essentially a perfectly closed circle of equity.
I see the numbers here. 98.3% of women and 98.9% of men have at least some secondary education.
It's incredible.
That is a statistical dead heat. It means that access to education is entirely decoupled from gender.
Which is phenomenal when you contrast it with the global reality.
Globally, only 62.0% of women have some secondary education, compared to 70.2% of men.
Right.
So not only is the entire world lagging roughly 30 points behind Slovenia's baseline, but the world has a massive 8-point structural bias against women baked right into its global education system.
And Slovenia basically eradicated that bias completely.
And that perfectly balanced educational foundation inevitably bleeds into the labor market, which is the final component of the Gender Inequality Index. Let's look at the labor force participation rate.
This is the percentage of the working age population that is either employed or actively looking for work.
In Slovenia, the female participation rate is 53.8%. The male participation rate is 63.2%.
So there's a gap of 9.4%.
Right. And we should acknowledge that gap is likely heavily influenced by those structural issues we discussed earlier.
Oh, for sure. The motherhood penalty. The unpaid care work that culturally falls to women and keeps them out of the formal labor force. The gap is very real.
However, to understand Slovenia's achievement, we have to look at how that 9.4% disparity compares to the rest of the planet.
The global numbers are stark.
They really are. The global female labor force participation rate is only 48.5%, while the male rate is 74.1%. That is a staggering global gap of 25.6%.
So while Slovenia hasn't achieved absolute perfection in the labor market, their 9.4% gap is structurally drastically tighter than the global norm.
Yeah.
Women in Slovenia are far more integrated into the active economy than the global average, and the disparity between men and women is less than half of what the rest of the world experiences.
Which all culminates in one final summary metric regarding gender. The UN calculates something called the Gender Development Index, or the GDI.
This is a brilliant piece of analytical math. The GDI takes the original three-pillared Human Development Index, health, education, and income, and calculates it completely separately for women and for men.
Okay.
Then it creates a ratio by dividing the female score by the male score. If the score is exactly 1.000, it means the society has achieved absolute, flawless statistical parity across all dimensions of human development.
And Slovenia's GDI score in 2023 is 0.997.
0.997.
I want you listening to really grasp the magnitude of that number, 0.997. It is as close to perfect statistical equality as you can possibly get in a complex, messy, real-world society of millions of people.
It really is.
It means that if a child is born in Slovenia today, their gender will have virtually zero statistical impact on their overall human development trajectory. Their health, their educational access, their baseline standard of living, the math, just evens out almost perfectly.
It is a profound, historic achievement. It proves that the gender disparities we see globally are not laws of nature. They are policy choices.
Wow.
But, and this is a massive but.
I know where you're going with this.
Yeah. Acknowledging this incredible achievement forces us to ask the next logical and frankly uncomfortable question in our deep dive.
Let's hear it.
We have spent the last half hour building a picture of a society that is highly educated, long-living, and incredibly equitable. They have constructed a beautiful, perfectly functioning house for their citizens. But what is the cost of maintaining that house? What is the toll on the neighborhood?
And by neighborhood, you mean the literal planet.
Exactly. We cannot responsibly discuss human development in the 21st century without looking at the environmental footprint required to sustain it.
This is a relatively new way of framing development, isn't it? For decades, no one really cared how much coal you burn as long as your citizens were getting richer.
Right, but the data provides a new metric now, the PHDI, the Planetary Pressures Adjusted Human Development Index.
Break that down for us.
The UN realized that celebrating a country for having a high HDI, while that same country contributes heavily to the destruction of the global ecosystem, is a fundamental contradiction.
Yeah, that makes sense.
You aren't really a developed nation if your lifestyle is sinking the lifeboat everyone else is in.
Yeah.
So the PHDI takes a country's pristine HDI score and mathematically penalizes it based on two environmental factors: carbon dioxide emissions per capita and material footprint per capita.
Let's use an analogy here. Think of it like having a beautiful, perfectly maintained mansion. Everyone inside has their own room, the heating works perfectly, the fridge is always full. It's a 0.931 on the inside.
Nice.
But to keep the lights on and the fridge full, the owners are dumping their raw sewage directly into the neighborhood creek, and they are burning tires in the backyard to run the generator. The internal ecosystem of the house is equitable and perfect, but the external footprint is heavy and destructive to everyone else on the block.
That is exactly the dynamic the PHDI is trying to expose. Let's look at the carbon data for Slovenia. Their per capita CO2 emissions sit at 5.34 tons.
And for context, the world average per capita emission is 4.54 tons. So Slovenia is noticeably, measurably higher than the global baseline.
And their material footprint, which measures the sheer tonnage of raw materials extracted globally to meet their domestic consumption demands, is also significant.
This raises a really tough, deeply philosophical question for you listening right now. Does achieving high human development living to be nearly 82, getting 17 years of world-class education, and creating an incredibly equitable society, does all of that inherently require burning more carbon and consuming more materials?
Is the Slovenian model a paradox?
Right. Can you only have this leak-proof bucket if you are actively extracting more from the earth than your fair share?
It is arguably the defining paradox of modern civilization. Let's look at the actual math of the penalty to see how steep this contradiction is. When the UN adjusts Slovenia's score for these planetary pressures, their HDI drops by roughly 15%.
A 15% penalty just for their environmental impact.
Yes. Now, compare that to the global average. When the world's average HDI is adjusted for planetary pressures, it only drops by about 10%.
Oh, wow. So Slovenia's environmental penalty is steeper than the global average.
Precisely. This data proves that while their internal social model is brilliantly efficient, their true prosperity, as it exists today, is tethered to high environmental costs. Again, we are just looking at the data objectively here. They are burning fossil fuels and consuming global materials at a rate that, if replicated by every single person on Earth, would shatter planetary boundaries.
So our straight-A student has a glaring flaw on their report card. They are getting top marks in sociology, public health, and gender studies, but they are seriously struggling in environmental science.
I wouldn't necessarily say they are failing, but they are colliding with the exact same structural wall as every other advanced industrialized economy. High living standards currently require high energy use.
Yeah.
The crucial difference, however, is that because Slovenia's social foundation is so incredibly stable, because they aren't battling massive internal poverty, illiteracy, or social unrest, they are arguably in a much stronger position to tackle the complex, expensive transition to a green economy than a country that is still struggling to provide basic needs.
Okay, we have unpacked a massive amount of data today. We have looked at the raw progress, the incredible inequality adjustments, the near-perfect gender parity, and the heavy planetary toll. Let's pull all these threads together and look at the final scoreboard.
Let's do it.
When we apply all these different lenses, what is the ultimate verdict on this country's strategy?
The shifting rankings tell the complete story of what they value.
Let's review them. Baseline HDI rank, they sit at 21st in the world.
A very strong showing, but fundamentally driven by standard averages.
But then we apply the inequality-adjusted HDI, the IHDI. When we account for how fairly that development is actually distributed to the citizens, their rank doesn't drop. They actually move up. They jump from 21st to 11th in the world.
Think about the implication of that jump. It means there are 10 entire countries ahead of them on the baseline list, countries with more raw wealth and higher gross development that are so fundamentally, structurally unequal that they immediately fall behind Slovenia the moment fairness is factored into the math.
And then even with that heavy 15% environmental penalty we just discussed, when we look at the planetary pressures adjusted HDI, the PHDI, they still sit highly ranked at 12th in the world.
If we synthesize all of this data, how do we characterize Slovenia's approach to human progress? I would define it as a highly introverted and meticulously efficient development model.
Introverted. That's an interesting word for a country's economy. Break that down for me.
Think about the development models of the global superpowers. The massive economies spanning North America or East Asia. Their models are inherently extroverted, expansive, and highly extractive.
Right.
They are designed to generate staggering, incomprehensible amounts of raw wealth at the very top. They produce global billionaires, massive multinational monopolies, and world-dominating tech sectors. But they accept, as a cost of doing business, that millions of their own citizens will be left behind in poverty, with crumbling public health outcomes, stagnant wages, and fractured education systems.
Their efficiency loss to inequality is massive.
Exactly. They accept a bucket with giant holes in it, as long as the bucket itself is huge.
Wow.
Slovenia's model is the antithesis of that. It is introverted. It does not focus its energy on creating a towering, infinite ceiling of wealth for a fraction of a percent of the population. Instead, it focuses relentlessly, almost obsessively, on maximizing the floor of its society.
Maximizing the floor.
It ensures that the absolute baseline requirement for a dignified human life, 81 years of health, 17 years of expected schooling, and an airtight social safety net is guaranteed for everyone. They engineer the floor to be as high as legally and practically possible.
So if they have already engineered this incredibly high floor, and they have achieved a GDI of 0.997, what is next? Where does a country like this go from here?
The data provides a roadmap for their 2030 Sustainable Development Goals.
What are the next frontiers for the straight A student?
The data points to two incredibly clear, non-negotiable mandates for the next decade if they want to maintain their leadership position and truly secure their future. The first, unequivocally, is decarbonization.
They have to stop dumping sewage in the creek. They have to relieve the planetary pressure.
Absolutely. The 15% drop in their PHDI is the glaring vulnerability in their entire model. They must figure out how to uncouple their high standard of living from carbon emissions and raw material extraction.
And how do they do that?
This means rapidly transitioning their energy grid to renewables, electrifying their transportation networks, and shifting their industrial base to circular, sustainable models. If they can maintain their incredibly high baseline HDI of 0.931 while drastically shrinking their carbon footprint, their planetary ranking won't just hold steady, it will skyrocket.
And the second frontier?
Closing that stubborn $17,000 gender income gap in the labor market.
The Achilles heel.
Yes, they have achieved educational parity. They have secured reproductive health. They have massively increased political representation. The final, and arguably hardest mile, is ensuring that the economic machinery values male and female labor equally in pure dollar amounts.
That requires dismantling deep cultural norms, doesn't it?
It does. It requires dismantling the norms that cluster women into lower-paying care sectors. It requires fiercely targeted policies regarding parental leave that force men to take equal time out of the workforce, leveling the playing field. It requires absolute corporate wage transparency.
It is a profound and incredibly challenging roadmap. We have taken a massive journey today, diving deep into over 3 decades of human data. We started in the early 1990s, looking at a nation navigating its post-transition reality, and we traced its mathematical, deliberate evolution into a global benchmark for equality, health, and social resilience.
It's a remarkable story.
We saw how a 26% increase in an index score actually translates into a tangible extra decade of life and a college-level baseline education for millions of people.
And crucially, we saw how a society can engineer an incredibly low 4.9% inequality loss rate. They proved, with decades of empirical data, that massive economic disparity is a policy choice, not an inevitable law of modern economics.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought to end on today. You listening, I want you to really mull this over as you go about your day. If a relatively small European country can mathematically engineer a social system where nearly every single citizen gets an equal, highly nutritious, and long-lasting slice of the pie, what does that say about the massive, resource-rich global superpowers that routinely accept losing a quarter of their human potential to inequality?
It is the defining question for the future of global development. Does immense size and massive wealth inherently breed inequality? Is it simply impossible to manage a population of hundreds of millions without massive efficiency losses and structural failures?
Okay, is social equity simply a matter of choosing the right metrics to care about?
Exactly. If a government only optimizes for GDP, they will inevitably get inequality. But if a government optimizes for human development and fairness, do they get Slovenia?
That is something to take with you. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into your sources. We encourage you to take this framework, take this leaky bucket analogy, and look at your own local communities. Look at the metrics your city council or your national government uses. Are they just tracking the money, or are they tracking actual human potential? Are they actively fixing the holes in the bucket? Keep asking the hard questions and keep looking for the real human meaning behind the numbers.